Hello friends, thank you for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to be identifying 9 different types of people that you might typically run into when talking politics. And the goal of this video is to provide you with ways you can introduce these people to Andrew Yang depending on where they lie in the political spectrum. And at the end of the video, I'm going to be discussing a bonus 10th type of person you might run into and how you can introduce them to Andrew Yang as well. Thank you for joining me today. Let's get started. The first group of people I want to discuss today are going to be the progressive lefty types. This type of person will not vote for establishment candidates typically. Out of everyone I'm going to be discussing in this video, this group right here tends to lean the furthest in one political direction, which is very far left. These people tend to care more about things like wealth inequality. They may be feminists or environmentalists as well. If they're a Bernie Sanders supporter, most likely this type of person is going to be also a progressive lefty. Before I begin explaining how to introduce Yang to a progressive lefty type personality, I want to start with this disclaimer. There is no foolproof way to introduce Andrew Yang to anybody. In my opinion, with all of these personality types, the best way is going to be simply to introduce them to a long-form discussion, such as the Joe Rogan Experience or the H3 podcast, or the Ben Shapiro Show, Sunday Special, any of the long-form discussions that he's been on. The type of format you would want to introduce them to will depend on their personality type, so have that in mind. Like if it's a conservative personality, you might want to point them to the Ben Shapiro Show instead of one of these other places. Or if it's more of a progressive type, you might want to throw them to the H3 podcast. And with that out of the way, let's begin discussing how you can introduce Yang to one of your progressive lefty friends or family members. The first tip I have for you if you're speaking to a progressive lefty is never talk bad about any of the people that they're following. For example, if they're following Bernie Sanders, don't try to get into a conversation with them about how Andrew Yang is better at each policy than Bernie Sanders is. I don't think that will work. In the mind of a Bernie bro or a progressive, they're going to hear you start bashing and think, he's just anti-Bernie, he's just blah, 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 blah. Blah. And it's not going to go anywhere. Instead, how about try this? If they're, let's just say, a 2016 Bernie bro where they supported Bernie Sanders in 2016, the best conversation starter might instead to mention the Yang media blackout casually. Point out how it's similar to the 2016 Bernie media blackout and use that as your anchor point to point them into the direction of getting to pay attention to Andrew Yang. If they realize that Yang is being blacked out the same as Bernie Sanders, they might actually start listening to their message and realize Yang is a progressive just like Bernie is. And once you make this realization trigger in their mind through the Yang media blackout and how the establishment is actually against him, this is going to trigger them to then research him. And once they research Yang, this is only going to create a snowball effect. This is the ultimate goal that we have, is to get anyone to research him, because once they do, they will then become Yang Gang. The second group I'm going to speak of today are going to be people on the conservative right. You can identify this type of person typically by their passion with the First and Second Amendments, the First Amendment being the freedom of speech, and the Second Amendment being the right to bear arms. This type of person typically wants the government out of your lives and as unintrusive as possible. And opposed to the progressive lefty, you might find this person wants the government to change as little as possible. Typically, you might find this person lives by a very high moral standard that they have set for themselves. And when they look at candidates, this is also something they consider. So if a candidate doesn't quite line up with their morals, they might look to their ideology and vote with that instead. However, if the candidate doesn't line up with their ideology, they might look to their morals and vote based off of that. In 2016, I believe most of these people did not come out and vote for Donald Trump. However, I believe that Donald Trump may have satisfied one of these two categories for these types of people. If you run across this personality type, here are my tips to you to get this person to start looking into Andrew Yang. As I stated earlier, this person typically wants the government out of your life as much as possible, and this generally kind of makes them an anti-progressive personality, which means they typically don't like people like Bernie Sanders. With that line of thought, the first point I would bring up to this person is casually mention how Yang actually disagrees a lot with Bernie's policies when it comes to like the Medicare for All and when it comes to the wealth tax. And with this person, I would actually go to Yang 2020 with them directly and go over the policies with them. Look at the policies that they might agree with and might disagree with and talk them through each policy. And aside from that, the next step I would take with this person is introduce this person to interviews with his wife. And if you can make him morally superior to Trump in the mind of a conservative, this would mark one of the two pillars that I believe most conservatives would need to meet in order to start considering Andrew Yang. As I mentioned earlier with Trump, with this person, if Trump lines up with their ideology, this person might come out and vote for Trump. However, people disagree with him morally. They might actually look at Andrew Yang and agree with Yang more morally and have some ideologies they agree with on Yang, and that might be enough to push this person to start looking at Yang and potentially become Yang Gang. The next group I want to bring up are the policy-driven voters. In my opinion, these people tend to be either center-right or center-left, and they're also the most politically active online, especially on Twitter. Another thing with this group is that a lot of them are already a part of the Yang Gang or they are Bernie bros. One thing they tend to do is use policies as a sort of litmus test. If a certain candidate does not meet up with their policies that they are most passionate about, they will not look at that candidate and they will dismiss them based on that policy. While this group of people tend to be most politically active during the primary season, if their candidate does not end up winning, they will most likely become inactive during the general election and not vote. If you happen to cross paths with the policy-driven voter and they're not already a part of the Yang Gang, chances are they've already researched all of the candidates already, and what they've most likely done is dismissed Andrew Yang as a serious candidate at this point. The first step with this group of people is to figure out who they're supporting and why they're supporting. Once you know who they're supporting, you can figure out which policies they actually are leaning on to support this person. And the best strategy at this point would be to send them counter policies that Yang has. Because at this point, we all know that Yang has a policy for just about everything. Let's just say they're a Joe Biden supporter and they support him on taking away Social Security or something. I don't know what Joe Biden supports. But let's just say they're a Joe Biden supporter. Again, you would just send them that counter policy argument that Yang has. A couple of things I want you to consider about this group in particular is that A, you're going to get a lot of pushback when you throw policies at them, and B, the strategy is a very slow game strategy. It could take weeks to a couple of months to potentially not even happening with this group. If someone in this group has already made up their mind, there's really nothing you can do about it except push the policies that you think might help them sway to Yang's direction. The next group on this list are the always vote red, always vote blue types. The way you can distinguish this person is their absolute disdain for the other party. It doesn't matter what policies they're pushing, they just don't like the other party. When you poke at them about this, they will probably initially say, "No, I'm just for the policies and I support these policies." But when you dig further into it, you'll realize that it's just nothing but a blank slate when it comes to policies. Another thing to consider about the always votes red, always vote blue types are they typically don't like fringe candidates. What they'll end up doing is vote for the safest candidate that they believe will win, and this is usually decided by the mainstream narrative. In other words, they've really never questioned the policies, and instead they're just most likely going off of the way they were raised and brought up. When you're brought up to always vote a certain color, when you grow older and you never question the policies behind it, you're just going to end up always voting that way for the rest of your life. That's this type of person. And one other thing I want to note specifically about the always votes red type is that you probably won't get this person to vote for Andrew Yang in the general election despite what you tell them. When attempting to Yang an always votes blue person in particular, there are two main things that I would want you to consider. The first being that you need to prove to them that Yang isn't trying to take away votes from another candidate and possibly mess up the election. You can do this by pointing them to any of the times that he's mentioned that he would do anything in his power to help whoever becomes the nominee at the end, and he wants a place in the administration even if it isn't as president. The second thing to consider when attempting to Yang a person that always votes blue is that you want to prove to them that Andrew Yang is actually the best candidate to defeat Donald Trump. These always votes blue, as I mentioned, they really dislike the other party. And in this case, it's Donald Trump, and they very much dislike Donald Trump. So if you can convince them that Yang is the best candidate to defeat him, they will switch over and end up voting for him. The best way, in my opinion, to convince this person that Yang is actually in the best position to defeat Donald Trump is to start off by pointing out his age in relation to the other people on stage. These people really are looking at age as a factor in this race. They realize that someone with not much energy is not going to be a good matchup against Trump. The second thing you want to point out with this person is that Andrew Yang takes away the most voters from Donald Trump. With these two things combined with his age and the fact that he takes away the most voters from Trump, this makes him the best bet to defeat Donald Trump. If you can convince this person of these two things, you'll have them convinced that Yang is the best person to defeat Trump. For the person that votes red always, you actually wouldn't want to approach them talking about how good Andrew Yang is and how much better he is than Trump. This strategy wouldn't necessarily work against this person. Instead, what you could do is point to the frontrunners, Elizabeth Warren in particular, and Bernie Sanders, and talk about how bad these two people are for the country. And you could point out that since the RNC has already chosen Donald Trump as their frontrunner, there is no risk of messing up Trump's odds. Instead, you want to convince this person that since the RNC has already chosen Donald Trump as the frontrunner, this frees them up to vote in the Democratic primaries against the candidates that they absolutely do not want to win. You can explain to them that out of all the candidates on the field, the DNC is most anti-Yang right now. And if you were to cast a vote for Yang as a Republican, this would be the same as an anti-vote against the Democrats. Of course, getting always vote red to vote anything in a Democratic primary is a little bit tricky, so this may be hit or miss. Also, if the person decides to go along with this strategy, make sure that if you're in a closed primary state, that you get them to register as a Democrat. And remind them that this won't affect who they're able to vote for in the general election. If they still want to vote for Trump in the general, they still are more than welcome to. All right, everyone. Before I get on to these next three types of people, I just want to say if you're finding this content helpful, please don't forget to like this video and share it around with your friends that you think might benefit off of it. All right, let's continue. The next on the list are going to be the anti-establishment voters and the never-Trumpers. These people, in my opinion, are going to be the easiest to get to vote for Andrew Yang out of anyone that we've mentioned up to this point. Typically, people in this category won't necessarily side with a political party, but rather they're going to be against something. For example, one easy way to identify a never-Trumper is if they've never voted as a Democrat before, but since 2016, they're adamant Democrats. This is a good sign that they're a never-Trumper. As for the anti-establishment type, these people might have voted for Gary Johnson in 2016, or they actually might have voted for Donald Trump in 2016, but they never voted Republican before in their lives. Something to take note about, particularly with the anti-establishment voters, is that usually they have bigger issues that are not being talked about on the main stage by any of the candidates. Because certain issues are not brought into the mainstream view, these people typically do vote anti-establishment for this reason. Because of this, this also makes Yang one of the best candidates for these types of people. So if the anti-establishment personality hasn't even heard of Andrew Yang at this point, this is the perfect opportunity to just push them towards Yang's direction and explain that he is the most pushed back against candidate on the field today. As far as the never-Trumper goes, the best argument to place against them is that all of the current Democratic candidates are very weak, and all of them are very likely to lose against Trump. There are even arguments that Bernie Sanders is a very weak candidate against Donald Trump. However, any single statistic that's come out, any polling that's been done, any sort of metric that we can measure by, Andrew Yang by far has the best chance to take away votes from Donald Trump and therefore defeat him. So if you're going to place your bet on any candidate, Andrew Yang would be that person for the never-Trumper. With this person, you can kind of use the same strategy as well that you used for the person that always votes blue. All right, last on this list, but certainly not least, are the data-driven voters. The cool thing about this group is that most of them are already Yang Gang. If they are not a part of the Yang Gang already, chances are they haven't heard of Andrew Yang yet or haven't looked that much into him. The cool thing about this group is all you need to do is send them studies, send them data points, send them the talking points that Yang has in regards to the data shown. Doing this will most likely convince these people that Andrew Yang is the person they need to vote for. And the thing about these people is that most of them are independents, so you don't expect them to lean towards a political party, but typically they have a more unbiased approach when it comes to politics. All right, well, that's all I have for today. Thank you for joining me on these... Wait, what was that? Oh my gosh, you're right. I did mention there was a bonus 10th person that I'm going to go over at the end of this video. Well, here that bonus person is. That bonus 10th person is the never votes person. This person is actually really easy to identify. They could be in their late 20s, early 30s, 40s, they've had many years to vote, but they've actually never gone out and voted. The reason for this may be that this person has never just been into politics, or they've never found the thing that they're most interested in or passionate about. In my opinion, the best way to get this person to actually participate in the general election is to get them talking about universal basic income and how not just you, but every one of your family members will get $1,000 a month potentially if Andrew Yang becomes president. And at the worst case, if nothing comes out of their vote, then all they did was waste a few minutes of a couple of days of the year. And with all of that said, this was me identifying 10 different types of people you can yang and me giving you my strategy as to how I would yang them if I came across these people in real life. Again, I really hope this information was helpful to you. And again, don't forget to share this video with a friend, like it, and if you like this content, please subscribe for future releases. Thank you guys for joining me. Have a great day, and don't forget humanity first.